Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session titled On-Ramps, How to Get More People into Impactful, High-Absorbency Careers with our speaker, Joey Savoie. I'm Valerie Pang, and I'll be the MC for this session. This talk will explore how to get into and help others get into higher impact career paths. It will focus on the creation and utilization of late-stage on-ramps for top career paths and covers careers including policy, for-profit entrepreneurship, charity entrepreneurship, and research. It looks at careers from a more systematic perspective, considering both the career's impact per person and its effective absorbency of people per year. Following Joey's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Joey will respond to your questions. So please submit questions through the shortcut live discussion feature. After about 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. So let me now introduce our speaker for this session. Joey Savoie is the co-founder of Ambitious Impact, also known as AIM, an organization created to help individuals make a large positive difference in the world. Joey works on high-level strategy across AIM's departments with the goal of scaling AIM's programs so that they can support highly talented individuals, find highly impactful opportunities to do good across a broad range of skill sets and fields of work. Prior to AIM, Joey co-founded Charity Science, a meta organization that increased the amount of counterfactual funding going to high-impact charities. And subsequently, he co-founded Charity Science Health, a nonprofit that increases vaccination rates in India using mobile phones and behavioral nudges. So without further ado, I would like to invite Joey to give his presentation.
Hello. Thank you so much, Valerie, for the introduction. And indeed, today we're going to be talking about building backwards and creating on-ramps and all these kind of EA meta related concepts about ultimately how to get people into high impact careers. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the structure of the talk. So it's a little bit different from other talks. One thing is that you have to deal with the occasional bad joke. I won't be able to tell if anyone's laughing due to our digital format here, so I'll just assume that a couple will land and most won't. The rest of the structure is pretty typical EA mix, abstract concepts, a few real-world examples. I bring up what charity entrepreneurship and ambitious impact is doing in this space in terms of how to kind of utilize these techniques as an organization, but I'll also talk about some stuff about how to utilize it as an individual. At the end, we'll have lots of time for Q&A, particularly if I end up talking really fast, which I sometimes do. And there's also an office hours right afterwards to continue the questions if you have more. So let's dive into the problem first off. The first problem is that there is a gap between talented people who want to create high impact careers and talented people who are in these high impact careers and having a huge amount of impact. So on the left-hand side here, we have a question mark dude who's probably going through an existential crisis, definitely studied philosophy. Maybe we have a gear dude holding a gear. He's into a STEM subject and now has no idea what to do with it. On the other side, we have a light bulb and a target because the EA movement actually finds you if you don't include at least one light bulb in your presentation. So I had to add that in. So how do we transition these two? Well, we build some steps. You can think of it as a staircase, people going from kind of abstractly not knowing what career they want to do, step by step until they're into this really high impact career. So we can add a slightly abstracted thing here. The concept I'm most going to talk about during this talk is the idea of on-ramps, which is making a gap between these two steps easier. Notice that's not the entire process that's getting easier, it's just one particular step. Steps aren't very great. Not only are they not wheelchair friendly, but they're also very intimidating for people. So how I'm going to define on-ramps is replicable systems to make reaching a certain goal easier, making a certain transition easier between two steps than it would be otherwise. I'm also going to abstract our humans to a well-rounded circle to make them fit the rest of the art style and to make it a little bit easier to follow when there's lots of people on these ramps. So the next question, as soon as we start thinking, okay, maybe we can make an on-ramp, maybe we can make a step easier, is what career paths should we focus on? Where should we actually build these on-ramps? And I want to talk about two factors, one that's pretty familiar and one that's a little bit more new. The factor that's familiar is impact per person. This is the thing that the EA movement talks a lot about, and we'll go into a little bit deeper. The second thing is absorbency of the career path, which is a little bit less common, but I also want to talk about because I think it's equally important when thinking about the movement as a whole, instead of just thinking about it as an individual. So first, the impact. When building and talking about the impact of a career, We do a couple of things differently at Ambitious Impact than the EA movement abroad does it. And I want to talk about and highlight some of these differences that are a bit unique. One is we really like setting an impact baseline. So one of the things we tell people to do is to consider what would be the default option, the default career path that you're going down. And then you want to think about how your new career path deviates from that. So a great impact baseline is the idea of earning to give. If you could earn, say, $100,000 and donate half of that, that's nothing to scoff at impact-wise. Any job that you then consider has to actually beat that impact bar. It doesn't have to beat zero. It has to beat that 50K to charity. And that's kind of the beginning counterfactual impact that you're going to end up having. The second thing is counterfactuals in the more traditional way that EA talks about it, which is the difference between you taking a job and the next best person taking that job. I think for many roles, this is a bit overestimated, actually. So for instance, when we hire and for most of our programs, we actually typically don't let in the next best person. There's an objective bar in which it's very rare for someone to be able to pass, and we might not even hire for the role or might just have fewer people who end up starting a charity. But this is a factor for jobs that are really, really competitive. So maybe jobs as grant makers or maybe jobs where there's a very fixed number of slots in politics. Final thing I want to talk about that we do a bit differently is we think about limiting factor a lot. Thinking about your field, your cause area, what really stops the field from growing can change your perspective quite a bit. In animals and mental health, for example, my sense is that they're more funding limited than talent limited. So this could affect an individual calculation, even if you think you can beat that kind of earning to give baseline. Do you need more people who are working in the career, or do you need more people who are ultimately donating funding? Those things all kind of balance together. These are all kind of individualized factors, things that you can consider yourself as an individual. But there's a second part that I want to talk about, which is a little bit broader in scope, a little bit more movement oriented, which is absorbency. And by absorbency, I'm kind of talking about the equivalent of room for more funding. So what's the absolute number of people that can go into the career path? So not just thinking as an individual, what's the impact, but thinking how many people can we actually send down this route? And also, what's the realistically achievable number given skill sets? So, conceivably, there's a lot of presidents in the world. In practice, it's quite difficult to become a president, so we probably shouldn't consider it a high absorbency career path. And I care about this because as soon as we start thinking about a movement, as soon as we start thinking about orgs that are doing things in bulk, Ambitious Impact being one of those orgs, we have to think about past the limits of kind of our personal impact and towards as a movement what we want to pursue. I also think this really directly applies to anyone who's working in EA Meta, so group organizers, people giving career guidance, and even broader things like media and journalists and people writing on the EA forum, because this affects more people than just yourself. It no longer becomes an individual calculation, it becomes kind of an aggregate calculation. Where do we want more people in the movement going in general? So bearing those two factors in mind, we know that there's a destination, which we'll mark with an X, like an old pirate map, an end-line impactful career. And we know that there's people who have many steps between them and the destination. More realistically, we can actually fill in the map with a whole bunch of people all along the staircase. Some people who are really close to the end-line goal of having a really impactful career, and some people who are many, many steps away. So we have the population here. Now, for the destination, I'm going to use Rob Mather. Rob Mather's a talented founder, national treasure, 250 million bed nets, tens of thousands of lives saved. And that's a lot. If you stack 250 million bed nets up, it'd be very tall. It'd be a lot of good that he's done. And he's a good kind of pathway or model to emulate of, okay, if we could get more Rob Mathers in the world, we could probably have a lot more impact. To broaden it slightly, the example career path of this is NGO founding. So idea is simple: set up an evidence-based organization that's better than others in the field. You can have a massive amount of impact. Rob Mather's one with the Against Malaria Foundation. LEAP is another that came out of our program. 50 million people prevented exposure to lead poisoning, $900,000 equivalents. This is a fantastically exciting career path, but it does have a weakness. The absorbency is small. The availability of mid-stage funding and top talent for new organizations is limited, ultimately meaning we can't start 10,000 charities a year, even if we had really great founders to do that. So that's a real weakness of this career path when we're thinking about an on-ramp building organization like Ambitious Impact and our charity entrepreneurship program that we have. We know pretty well what it takes for someone to get into this career path. So in some way, the bounds around what makes a Rob Mather, what makes a really good charity founder is understood. We know that people have to be really ambitious. We know they have to be very results oriented. We know they have to have a kind of laser sharp focus on evidence, and they have to be fast moving and willing to kind of like move quicker than a typical large scale organization or bureaucracy would. There's a startup mindset that's required. But this is pretty well understood. We can quite easily model and know what makes a good founder, and thus what might be lacking as people go up the staircase here. Now, on the staircase, as I mentioned before, some people are really, really close. Say we have Bob, who's only one letter off of Rob. And then we have others who are way down the staircase, say Charlie, someone who has no letters in common with Rob at all. There's two different ways we can kind of approach this challenge of, okay, we have this huge population, we want to move them up the staircase towards the X. One way is first mile solutions, and one way is last mile solutions. First mile solutions work right at the bottom, maybe first telling people about a career path, or maybe broadly talking about effective altruism or doing good with your career in general. Last mile solutions are right near the top, taking those people who are already 95% of the way there and getting them that last inch. I'm going to argue that there's some real cons of doing the early on-ramp, even though it's very common in the effective altruism movement for us to do these early on-ramps. One is traffic jams. You can already see our little dots all kind of built up there on the second stairway. In practice, what this means is a lot of people with certain skill sets, but maybe not enough to actually get the job. So you end up with a bunch of frustrated people who are kind of close towards the job, have some promise, maybe get through a couple of interview rounds, but don't ultimately get the impactful career that they want. It also can result in losses over the steps. So although this looks promising, we have a bunch of people built up at the bottom here, and maybe we'll be able to slowly move them up the ramp. There are going to be people who fall off over time, people who get distracted, people who decide to pursue a different career, people who do all sorts of things. This is many, many steps away from them ultimately getting to that destination, getting to doing the most impact. And sadly, the steps aren't linear in terms of impact. So it might feel satisfying to get someone from step 1 to 2, but it might be that most of the impact actually comes from step 9 to 10. And indeed, I think this is actually often the case, where training people up, getting some knowledge, really important and essential to get people up the ladder. But where people do a lot of their best impact is right when they get that high impact job at the end. A lot of the time, people's careers are kind of power lawed with a few jobs making up a lot of the impact that they end up doing over the course of their life. So the other option is doing a late stage on-ramp. This is going right next to charity entrepreneurship, or right next to the career that we want people to end up. And I think this solves a lot of the challenges. We don't have the same traffic jam that we have. And we know that those people are really close, so they can just move right over. And we can also measure the impact a little bit more clearly, because we don't have to account for aggregate fall off and all this sort of thing. We can actually just look at how many people at the end of the day end up getting to this new career path. I think charity entrepreneurship is an example of a late on-ramp. It's very late, in fact. Most of the people we lend to the program are fantastically talented already. They already have this in mind as a career. They've already done some really impressive stuff. They've kind of already built up some of the momentum and skills and knowledge that they need to do a charity. We're just helping them kind of knock down those last few barriers. They're a step away from doing something great. Now, this means when we're looking for people who are a good fit here, it's ultimately people who already have 90% of the pieces figured out. And there's a bunch of cons of that, but the pros are, it means they can get kind of actual impact happening in the world a lot quicker. So the next problem that can occur when we have a situation like this is what happens once you kind of figure out all those circles, once all the Bobs, Rods, Roys, everyone who's close to Rob has moved up. Say we have more bed nets than we know what to do with. Now what? And there's a few different options that we can kind of consider or do when it comes to kind of reaching capacity, when we've saturated the market and kind of fixed that on-ramp such that anyone who's really close by can make that last jump easy. And this is actually a big part of why charity entrepreneurship kind of broadened to our now ambitious impact. We thought about, well, maybe one of the solutions here is building multiple on-ramps, going to different career paths, going to different areas, and thinking about what sort of last mile steps we can set up so that people who are right near the edge of having a fantastic, impactful career can get there. And we'll go into a few of these in depth, but the concept kind of cross applies far outside of ambitious impact. A lot of people can think about, okay, well, what are multiple career paths, or what are particularly promising career paths where there's a gap or a bottleneck at the last stage? And then how do we make a ramp to smooth that out, to make that more promising? So let's talk a little bit about grant making. This is another career path that is really, really impactful, massive impact per person, but ultimately very low absorbency. So it has a similar pro and con profile to charity entrepreneurship. We ran a grant making program. It came out of our charity entrepreneurship program and turned out that grant makers used a lot of the same tools and techniques that charity entrepreneurs needed in terms of measuring impact and assessing organizations in kind of a similar way to charity entrepreneurship charities assessing themselves. So this ended up being a program that was kind of aimed at people who are already philanthropically grant making or were going to do philanthropic grant making and just improving those techniques, improving those skills. Again, we're not taking someone who's 100 miles off of doing really effective grant making. We're taking someone who's a mile off of doing effective grant making or a step off of doing effective grant making. Often these people were already very sympathetic to the concepts of being more effective and just needed a little bit of the tools, a little bit of the space, a little bit of the social community to bring them to become a really great grant maker. Last mile solution when it comes to grant making. Now let's look at a different area and one with a different profile. This is the first one we're looking at that actually has a really high absorbency. This is our newest program, AIM Founding to Give. And the concept is pretty simple. Like charity entrepreneurship, you can be successful and entrepreneurial in the for-profit space. And in this particular case, we want people to pledge a high amount of their large-scale exits. So 50% of above $1 million exits. And this is a really cool pledge because it's not too financially painful if your startup doesn't work, which many startups don't, or if your startup exit's really small, but it does capture kind of a lot of the pie of impact on these particularly high value, high exit startups. So when someone does exit with multi-million-dollar exits. And a really exciting thing about this from kind of an EA careers perspective is Founding to Give is not limited in the same way that the foundation program or the charity entrepreneurship program is. It can actually handle lots and lots of people because it interacts with the rest of the world and standard VCs and other incubators and this sort of thing very early. It has a much higher absorbency. So even if the individual career path is not competitive, and I think debatably it is competitive, but even if it wasn't, this could actually be a really exciting path for tons and tons of people, particularly people who are kind of already entrepreneurial aligned. So part of the inspiration for this program, of course, was we had a really fantastically strong pool of entrepreneurs, not all of which were perfect for charity founding, but many of which would have been great for for-profit founding, looking for a lot of the same skill sets in terms of ambition, evidence-based, moving fast, breaking things, this sort of thing. So this is a program that I think in some ways has much more potential than our other programs because it can absorb a higher number of people. We're not necessarily doing that at the first round. We're going to kind of start off slowly and MVP and test it. But conceptually, this is an exciting career path because it has higher absorbency. Now, of course, outside of ambitious impact, there's a whole bunch of career paths that could be on-ramped. We're covering a few different ones, including the ones that I talked about, and we're covering a few different cause areas within those ones, global health and well-being and animals primarily. And there's some other programs out there that do some similar things. So AI policy with Horizon, journalism with Tarbell, health policy with School for Moral Ambition. I'm really excited about these new kind of like schools, training programs, processes to help people get into these really high impact careers. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for other areas that Ambitious Impact isn't going to be focusing on in the next few years and none of these other orgs focus on, but could have these last mile on ramps. Something like policy work in the animal space strikes me as particularly promising. AI space, having something that has a bit more absorbency because there's a lot of people who want careers in AI but can't get them. Operations work, people have talked about setting up a training program for. I think there'd be a lot of value in that. Charity employees more broadly. So for every charity founder, there's 5 or 6 people at least hired into the charity itself. How do we do a great job of that? That seems like a really useful thing for possible on-ramps or possible future EA work. And I'd probably be more excited about these end-line on-ramps aiming at specific careers than it would be at a lot of the generalist work that happens in the EA movement right now, where we're kind of helping people in the first couple of steps. You do need both. You always are going to have some sort of balance, but I think we're under-indexed right now on these specific end-line career path advising. So what do you do if you buy this model? Well, you don't have to buy it because I'm telling it to you for free, but there are a few different ways to apply it at kind of different levels of micro versus macro. So let's talk about applying these lessons as an individual, as a single person. So one thing you can do as a single person is you can kind of start at the end. I think a lot of people are kind of inclined to do vague steps that feel like they move them forward concretely. But I actually think it's worth thinking quite concretely about where you want to go at the end of your career, or where you want to kind of build towards before you start building it. Yeah, there are some steps that are generalizably good and kind of safe, but I think people can sometimes use this as a procrastinatory mechanism. I know half of the reason why many people have done PhDs that I've talked to is as a procrastination mechanism. And I think that although it's scary to think about these big questions of, okay, where do I want my career to end up? And it can maybe even sound arrogant to be like, oh, I want to be here in 10 years or 15 years. I think having a really honest conversation with yourself, even if you don't share it with anybody, to think about what your journey might be will really, really help when it comes to this. Um, it can also bump into one of these other problems or fix one of these other problems that comes up a lot is think about what step will block you. So there's a story that I heard that relates to an entrepreneur, and he comes up with this great idea to get a monkey that can juggle while riding a unicycle and sell tickets at a really big markup. But the entrepreneur ends up spending a bunch of time determining how to name the act, and then they spend some time determining what color unicycle they should use and what brand. And they don't really get around to the real bottleneck, the real problem, which is finding a monkey talented enough to ride a unicycle and juggle, even after months spent all the things around it. And I think people kind of do this for their career. You know, the moral of the story is you got to think about what's the tough part, what's the hard thing that's going to be really kind of make or break, and then how are you going to encounter that? So say you're thinking about a career that turns out step 5 is really difficult and everyone always struggles with step 5. You kind of want to think about step 5 before you take step 1, 2, 3, and 4, because those first steps are easy. They're kind of like finding the right unicycle. That's not the hard part when it comes to this monkey training vaganza. You have to think about what is going to be the bottleneck of that given career. What's going to be the tricky part, and then how might you overcome that as an individual? So takeaways: don't procrastinate too much. Try to really think about your career ends, and then try to think about the journey, the little staircase that you're going on, and what might be the toughest part there, and how to not get stuck there. You don't want to be part of the traffic jam. You want to kind of have thought about that before you undergo your first major steps. Next, how to apply these lessons as an organization. So some of you are an organization. Well, none of you are literally an organization, but some of you run an organization, which is important, and that has kind of impact on a broader set of people. And I think that this draws back a lot of the individual lessons. Mapping out a theory of change for what specific career path you think the world needs more of, and thinking about how your org plays into that. Again, it feels a bit safer to just go, well, I'm going to train people in some skills and kind of hope they do some good. But I think it's a bit more honest to think through, okay, well, what are the odds that they go to the next step, the next step, the next step, and where ultimately do we have a lot of impact when people go through these steps? You can also look at the movement or career paths that you're connected to and see if there are people who are trapped at a step, particularly people trapped at a really high step. So one of the big inspirations for charity entrepreneurship, why it ended up being so exciting, is I met some other people who looked at the ideas, wanted to found the ideas, but weren't quite able to do it entirely by themselves. That's how Fortify Health ended up getting started. A little bit of mentorship and advice, and they were able to do something pretty amazing. They were trapped, but at a very high step. It really didn't take much to get them into that really high impact career. And then as an organization, I do think people should be thinking about late stage on-ramps instead of early stage on-ramps. So where is that last mile that you're able to help people? Where's the last step to get people into these really impactful careers? As a movement, I think that there's a lot of things we can also do that are really interesting. So I think one thing is the more interconnected we are with organizations and actors outside of EA, the better. Typically, jobs with higher absorbency have some sort of interaction with other people. So part of why Founding to Give has more absorbency than charity entrepreneurship is a lot of the charities get funded from a pretty small number of effectiveness-minded NGO actors, where in the for-profit world, there's 110 VCs, and you're kind of interacting with the broader world, and that makes it able to handle more people going down the same career path. Same thing happens with policy jobs. If you're only looking at jobs that are run by kind of a card-carrying EA organization, it's always going to be a more limited number than if you're looking at a slightly broader set. And as a movement, I think we should give higher weights to absorbency. So sometimes we find a charity that is really, really impactful, fantastically great, but it can only absorb tens of thousands of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, that might be very exciting as an individual donor. Maybe I'm only donating $10,000, so that fits me perfectly. But as a movement, that's a lot less exciting. GiveWell doesn't really have the appetite or interest in reviewing an organization that's only going to be able to absorb $10,000, even if it's a very cost-effective $10,000. you need something that you can throw a lot of resources and a lot of appetite behind. And I think this question comes up for careers too. If we're having a movement of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people, we have to think about where can many of those people add in? What's something that has a reasonable enough bar and a reasonable enough absorbency to handle a lot of people ultimately going down that career path. So I think giving a much higher weight to absorbency when thinking about these kind of career paths and what to advocate for individuals entering the movement and individuals who've been in the movement a long time. So to leave you with some appeals here, the world is really big. There's lots of problems. 200 billion spent in development aid, 23 billion animals subjected to factory farming, hundreds of thousands of people graduating from world's top universities. And I think we can actually be a lot more ambitious in achieving impact, particularly thinking about total impact instead of a pure individual impact. I want us to be able to provide connections and opportunities to kind of get talent into the next stage and creating useful on-ramps for impactful careers. I'd love a world where we have 10 career paths that are as well supported and kind of structured as charity entrepreneurship is as a career path now. And it seems very possible. I mean, charity entrepreneurship itself isn't a uniquely structured career path or a uniquely obvious career path. It's a really ambiguous career path. It's something that would probably be one of the least obvious things to do. But because we've built a meta organization around it, made it easier, made it more straightforward, it's now much more accomplishable for many, many people. So I think there's no reason we can't do that with a much wider set of career paths. Ultimately, we don't just want to understand how the world works. We want to be able to put people in positions to solve those actual problems, to make real progress, and to have a real big impact. That's my talk. I will mention that if you like information like this, we do have an online event coming up where we're going to stream a whole bunch of talks from our greatest charities called AIM Connect. So you can also look that up. And then, of course, we're going to have a Q&A, and there will be office hours right after that Q&A as well. Thank you.
So now we will proceed to our Q&A session, and we already have some questions from the audience. So one question from the audience is, it seems very hard to get into impactful careers due to location within low middle income countries. Do you have advice for how people in lower middle income countries can get impactful jobs?
Yeah, really great question. I think part of this is because we typically only promote careers that have a really small number of slots. And then if there's anything that's not quite aligned, so say your location isn't quite right, it's really difficult to get into that. So part of this is like a movement issue. I think we need to select career paths that have absorbency for people from all sorts of different contexts and backgrounds, careers that can absorb people from different countries. That seems really, really obvious and valuable. I guess as an individual, I'd be thinking about, okay, long term, what career paths are going to be benefited from this or not benefited from this, So thinking about LMICs, there's a lot of benefit of being a charity founder in an LMIC. There's a lot of benefits of doing specific policy work in LMICs. If there's something that's really abstract and academic, maybe there's not a particular benefit. If, you want to be a researcher at Oxford, that's going to be a real pain in the butt because visas are just going to make it consistently more challenging to be there. So I guess you kind of want to think about what the competitive advantage is. But I mostly think this is a movement failure as opposed to an individual failure. I think we just need to have a wider option of careers that people can actually pursue and are viable for a wider set of people.
Okay. The next question we have from someone called Tristan is, if people are bottlenecking at the early stages of their EA career, do we need some middle stage on-ramps to help people move up the ladder? If so, what would they look like?
Eventually, yes. So I do think that there's room for more kind of like EA advanced content or something like this. Like if you have stuff like the books that are get introduction points and the TED Talks and the EA intro fellowship course, I think there is this like gap in the middle where the difference between kind of having a PhD in effective altruism versus a bachelor's in effective altruism, there's just like not that many master's programs or something like that. So I think the most promising is on ramps right at the end. But the second most promising, I would start to go more mid-stage. I would start to think about, okay, well, what's advanced level content? What could that look like? Phew, I don't know. Discussion groups and book clubs I've seen get pretty advanced sometimes. I think a lot of it's about pairing people. So if you can find ways to kind of match 5 or 6 people who are maybe pretty familiar with the content, engaging with the forum pretty regularly, going to events like this and EAGs in general, but haven't quite cracked the full-time EA job, and then kind of give them some sort of context or some sort of thing to work on. Small scale projects I also think can be good for this. So volunteering or people co-writing stuff for the EA forum. I think there is scope for that. I think there is scope for some mid-stage development. But I do think that you'd have to have some pretty heavy pairing and filtration. It's really tempting to say like, oh, everyone's ready for the mid-stage, and you probably have to have some sort of vetting process to kind of group 10 people who would really benefit from high-level conversations with each other. And this is another thing that I think you can have huge disadvantages if you're in the wrong geography. So if you're in London, there's an event that happens once every couple of weeks that you can go to and have some of these slightly more advanced conversations. If you're virtual, it's a lot tougher. So yeah, I do think there is scope for that, but it would come down to matching and having some more advanced content.
Okay. Our next question is, um, okay. How does charity, this is question is by Dennis. How does charity entrepreneurship, or I guess AIM, align accepted candidates with the most suitable charity ideas to ensure a strong match between their skills, interests, and the charity's mission?
Yeah, really good question. So, how our process works is people are typically applying as individuals and will know vaguely what cause area they'll be interested in. So maybe someone will be applying with farmed animals or applying with global health or something like this, but they won't actually have a specific idea. And then throughout the duration of the program, they're testing out different co-founder matches. So they're working with 2 different people, every day, or working with multiple people over the course of a week, and they're also working on multiple ideas. So we have research reports and we have a sense of, oh, this cohort seems particularly policy strong, or this cohort is particularly animal oriented, or that sort of thing. But the actual ideas, people really don't know what ideas are good for them until they start working on them. And then it's about kind of finding that right mix of this co-founder is really great, matches my skill set really well. This idea seems really good. We both really like it. Every time we do work on it, we're making kind of optimistic progress. So I would say we try to get the right ingredients, and then the program itself is kind of the mixing process of combining them into something that leads to kind of a greater sum than the sum of its parts. So yeah, so most people don't know coming in exactly what idea they'll land on. They'll know really broad strokes, and then they'll kind of figure it out through working on it.
Okay. Our next question is from Rachel. She's asking, um, she's based in Asia, but it seems there aren't that many high impact orgs or careers in this part of the world. What would you suggest her, or others similar also in Asia, to do?
Yeah. So I guess there's a few different options here. One is look for remote things, so things that are attached to something that's international and then doesn't really have any regional focus or that sort of thing. I do think more and more jobs are going remote and international nowadays. So that's option A. Option B is find something that's like adjacent but really close to something that's really impactful. So say ultimately you want to work at a farmed animal org, but there's not that many orgs that are directly related to farm animal stuff. Is there stuff that's adjacent to that, or maybe slightly less effective animal oriented stuff that you could get a role in and kind of like build up capacity and skills? And then, of course, my entrepreneurial nature inclines me to go, well, what could be started then? I mean, maybe if there's a bunch of residual talent, some people should do kind of earning to give level stuff. Other people should do direct founding type stuff and kind of pair together to make some of these projects that can actually go off.
Okay, cool. Great suggestions. Um, we have a question from Adam, which is, are you working with other organizations that facilitate career transitions into impactful work to share information and collaborate or make decisions together?
Yes and no. Like we're pretty open and excited to share content, our curriculum, what we think works and what we think doesn't. A few are quite directly connected. So some of the orgs that we talked to or that I listed in the slides were either quite directly inspired by us or went through our program and were founded as a charity under us. So obviously those orgs have a pretty good affiliation. I think it's useful to knowledge share. I don't think it happens probably as much as is ideal. But we try to write up lessons and publicize things. And certainly we're excited and positive about more people starting things in the space. We've even toyed with the idea of having charity entrepreneurship program like run around on these sort of things and like think about what meta charities can be started that help on people's careers. So yeah, excited, but it depends on the org. If someone's doing a AI policy thing, we're just not going to be like as useful for that. It's not really an area we focus in. It's not really an area that we have expertise in. So I would say the closer the career paths are to stuff that people kind of going through our pipeline might connect to, the more connection and affiliation and coordination we have with the org.
Okay. We have another question by Sanja. What advice do you have for individuals trying to figure out what the REM towards their destination high impact career looks like, including the hardest obstacles on the way?
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll break that up into two parts. One is like finding out where your end is and how to do that. And I think one way is actually finding really concrete examples. So I love it when there's a career path and I can point at like three people where I'm like, I would love this job. Like if I could be doing that, if I could be kind of having that level of impact, that'd be really promising. So Rob Mather, I use a lot as an example because he was an example. I think without Rob Mather and some other really good founders like that, charity entrepreneurship doesn't exist. It exists because we could point at a few of these people and be like, hey, that looks really good. That looks like an endpoint that we should shoot for, a destination. So I think that's what I'd be thinking about. Like, who are the three most impactful people you know, or who are 10 people that are having a really fantastic impact? And is there clustering around a certain career path? Does that career path seem viable? And then in terms of finding kind of the bottleneck, finding the tricky parts in that career path, talk to people who have done that career path and kind of figure out, hey, what was the hardest step for you? What was the most difficult thing for you? So when we were first starting out the charity before, charity entrepreneurship, vaccination charity, we managed to talk to a lot of the leaders from top Givable charities and ask them, hey, what was the hardest part? What was difficult? What was easy? Where did you struggle on the journey? And their advice was super valuable. So I guess find the destination. If you can interview a few people like that or listen to what they say, it doesn't be direct one-on-one. It could be from a podcast or from a talk or whatever. But kind of ask, what was the tricky part? What was the most difficult hurdle to overcome? And then you can start thinking about, okay, is that going to be a hurdle for me, or is that part going to be easy? Is that a part that I'm naturally going to be less challenged by?
Okay. Um, Another question. This is by Pablo. How funding constrained is AIM, and what would you use marginal dollars for?
Yeah, it is marginal funding week, I suppose. Um, AIM itself is typically pretty comfortable. We typically are in the space where we think about exactly how much funding we think is optimal and kind of don't accept a dollar over that. Where I see a lot of value coming from in terms of marginal dollars is mid-stage charitable organizations. So orgs that are sub $1 million, maybe between year 2 and 5, something like that. That's, if I was saying, what's the most challenging thing for a charity? When is that going to kind of like struggle the most or die? That would be my answer, is like year 2 to 5. Like, are there mid-stage funders who are kind of comfortable with taking a risk, but it's not quite as new and shiny as the day one when it's launched. So something closer to the seed funding network or something closer to this mid-stage gap. That's the thing that I would do. In terms of what we do with marginal funding, I guess if we get more funding than we think AIM can productively use, we typically grant it to charities that are in that mid-stage funding spot or in the seed stage, something like that. I should note that I do have an interesting policy with Ambitious Impact where we are trying to find the sweet spot of cost effectiveness and really trying to maximize around that. So I do think there is a world where Ambitious Impact is double its current budget. I just don't think we'd get double our current impact with that, and I'm not very happy with that trade-off. So I kind of want to keep us at this really high peak marginal cost effectiveness, which typically means that we don't have a very large budget relative to what people would expect for a meta org of our size, and that makes it a little bit easier to fundraise. So I guess marginal funding probably in the regranting pot, maybe a little bit in the fund diversification pot, that sort of ballpark.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So we have another question by Angel, which is they like the CE model, but they're wondering how to make it more scalable. Because they want to be able to take such a model and make it available to the rest of the world and to a much wider group of founders. How would you go about doing that?
Yeah, we've tried to do a couple things in this. I wouldn't say we've done anything particularly clever or successful. The second year we ran it, it was during a COVID year, and we made an online version of the program that people could go through at their own pace, and it was more publicly accessible. It didn't result in as many people, I guess, utilizing it or benefiting from it. I think a tricky thing about increasing the absorbency of charity entrepreneurship as a career path is that charities that are average don't really do any impact. So by that I mean, unfortunately, the kind of GDP that has gone towards charitable giving has been fixed the last dozen years. So pretty much the same amount of money is going into the charity sector. So if you start an average charity and you kind of raise $1 million, you're typically pulling from another charity of some sort. So if you're average and pulling from an average charity, that's about zero impact. In fact, maybe a little bit negative because there's a bit of fundraising and a bit of transaction cost type stuff. So where you really get impact in the charity sector is from starting stuff above average or even well above average, stuff that's field leading. And I think starting field leading charities is really, really tough. So that's part of why we kind of overkill the amount of support that we give to these AIM charities. We give them a year's funding and we give them 2 months training and we vet 5,000 applicants and this sort of thing. It's a very intensive program, very heavy program for a very small number of charities. And that's partly because, according to our internal estimates at least, a field leading charity is just worth a really, really high amount of impact, where an average charity or even a slightly better than average charity isn't worth as much impact or even that much impact. So when thinking about scalability that way, I think it's thinking about, okay, well, does getting a charity from average to slightly above average, how much impact does that cause? And yeah, that's been very tough. I think there are other things that are much more linear. So looking at a grant making program, I think in some ways, if there's a grant maker and they're already deploying 1 million and you can make them 10% more effective, that's just great because that just kind of each incremental improvement works in a pretty similar way. I think with charity entrepreneurship, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if starting a bunch of B charities is as good as starting one A level charity. So I wouldn't be thinking about expanding the absorbency of that quite as much as I'd be thinking about, how can you maybe get a few more A charities, even if that ends up being a really kind of harsh selection process or a really intense round.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. So we have a few questions about I guess maybe like the upcoming cohort application. So one person is wondering, when would the next cohort application open? And then do you need to be fluent in English to apply?
Yeah, so we run 2 cohorts a year. There's almost always an active round happening or processing or coming up soon. So I think the next open round will be in a few months. Unfortunately, it is all in English, all the programming. We've looked into this, particularly the handbook seems quite viable to get translated into a few different contexts, and that seems like quite valuable, but we want to get it just right. So the CE handbook right now, it's gone through 2 versions, and I think version 3 will be happy enough to get it translated. Right now, I'm not happy enough with the handbook to kind of get it moved into 4 or 5 different languages, but it is something on our list in terms of a pretty valuable thing to do. The lectures and programming, unfortunately, is all in English because you need the cohort match to have everyone in the same language. So if we ran, say, like a cohort in Spanish or something like that, we'd have to have enough people to populate like a 15-person matching process, all who are primarily or can significantly speak Spanish. And typically, we don't see enough people in other languages to fill a whole cohort of that. Again, somewhat virtue of just where the EAM has gotten popular and is large versus places where it's more nascent.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Next question is, how do you measure, evaluate, and learn your impact?
So I guess there's 2 questions here. There's like AIM itself, and then charities, or actually even it could even be the question of how you measure your personal impact. So maybe I'll do all 3 of them, but super quick. charities, we try to get external evaluators to look at them, and eventually external evaluators typically do. So animal charity evaluators can look at our animal charities, GiveWell can look at our health charities, Founders Pledge as an external review, Rethink has done some research on this. That's kind of like our gold standard. Once our charities get old enough, we love it when they get externally evaluated, and then we look at how impactful that charity is relative to other charities, and then we take kind of like a marginal percentage of that credit. Like, okay, we helped that charity found, that's part of our impact, and that goes to how to measure AIM. We kind of look at a portfolio of all the charities that have come out of it. We have some sort of counterfactual estimate. What would have happened if we weren't there? Okay, this charity probably would have got started. This charity probably wouldn't have, that sort of thing. And then that aggregate becomes our impact estimate for ambitious impact itself. We plan on doing a very similar thing for both foundations and the for-profit program as well. Just look at the portfolio, foundations before, after, foundations that didn't go through the program, how they changed, and kind of look at the differences between them. As an individual measuring your marginal career impact, it really depends on the job. So when I think about careers at ambitious impact, I typically look at kind of our org level impact and then divvy that out by the 20 staff that we have, and then think about what that kind of individual number is, and then think about what the counterfactual is of that staff versus the next best staff. So that's how, you know, a staff member at AIM might calculate their impact. They go, okay, well, AIM is creating $10 million of value. It's 20 staff, that's 500K value, but I'm probably not twice as good as the next person. Maybe I'm only 15% better. So then that ends up with a couple $100,000 of counterfactual expected value. So something like that. I think it's really hard to know your impact unless you're donating directly. Then it's very easy to calculate because you just calculate how much money you're donating and what the impact of that dollar is, or knowing the org impact as a whole. So what's the value of that nonprofit or kind of meta org existing, and then how does that divvy up amongst the staff? Yeah, hopefully one of those was usefully aiming at what the question was asking.
Yeah, no, I think you answered it pretty comprehensively from different angles. We have another question, which is, do you currently have any ideas in any stage of development for targeting people who are already in impactful positions and making them even more effective and impactful?
Yeah, it's tough. It's a great dream. We have tried. So we did some charity consulting and advisory. I mean, this is kind of the obvious thing that is close by for us is, okay, well, are there charities existing in the field who could pivot or who could change? You know, if you make Oxfam 1% more effective, they could do great things. In practice, I've basically just never seen it work. It's just when a charity gets big and powerful and influential, it starts having so many other institutional obligations. So we've had cases where, you know, the CEO and the board all want to make a change and they still can't do it because they have 500 staff and they're too entrenched and it's too difficult. And, you know, you just think about it pragmatically. If you're running a charity with 500 staff and you realize that, oh, half of our actions are more impactful than the other half of our actions, it's very socially difficult to fire 250 people. It's even legally difficult to do something like that based on impact. So we have found that it's quite hard to transition big orgs to do stuff. Lots of people have tried. I'm very curious to hear success stories of this, particularly in the NGO sector. But for us, when we've done consulting, when we've done kind of advising type stuff, it's been tough. It's been hard to get people to move. I sometimes analogize it to trying to change the Titanic as it's heading towards an iceberg. You know, it's just very, very slow going. And you know, maybe there's some institutional things that you can do from the inside and that sort of thing, but externally, it's been very, very tough.
Oh, just to clarify, I think the person is also asking for what about people, not just orgs, but people who are in, say, an impactful position and becoming even more impactful.
I think that is pretty promising, especially if you're talking about people who are in impactful positions that other people don't see as impactful. So I think there's tons of people targeting billionaires. I think there's tons of people targeting presidents. I think like that sort of stuff, like if it's kind of like the obvious person according to 5 people on the street, I think that's tough because there's a million people going after it. But I think the people that have disproportionate impact that aren't really talked about, so maybe a staffer when it comes to policy, or maybe a chief of staff or a personal assistant of some big important person, I think that sort of stuff seems very promising. I do think that people in general can get into these principles and that sort of thing. Although again, I'd be kind of thinking about low-hanging fruit. If you kind of talk to someone about doing more good and having impact and there's just zero interest, I think it's probably best just to knock on the next door, just to look for the next person. If you're talking to someone who's in a pretty impactful position and they have an appetite and you can make it easier for them to learn more, get more involved, or connect them to someone in the movement who you think is particularly exciting or they'll particularly connect with, I think that's super valuable. And I think that's really useful to do.
Great. Let's just see if there are any more questions. Um, oh, I guess people were just looking for links to the AIM Connect event and links
Yes.
for the
Maybe
company
I'll,
that's working on AI policy. Maybe you could just put that on your swap card or something.
yeah, happy to put that on my swap card. And if you just look up AIM Connect online, I think you should be able to find it. But yeah, that's what it's all about, and actually very inspired by EAGxVirtual here. In terms of we have a big community, we wanted a few more people to be able to get involved. We have one event a year in person, but we wanted to do one online version to make it a bit more international, a bit more accessible to people. So yeah, very exciting and coming up soon. It's on December 5th.
Okay, great. Okay, I think we're about at time for our session. So thank you so much, Joey, for your really great presentation and also for answering all the questions from the audience. And thank you to the audience for attending this talk today.
Thank you.